By way of introduction, this is Bill Eckberg presenting on the War of 1812 and 1816 classic had sense. As we'll learn, the War of 1812 had impacts on the U.S. economy, the U.S. Mint, and large cent and half cent production. And with that, we will turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Len. Welcome everybody who's here. Actually, the War of 1812 didn't have anything to do with half cent production because they had already quit making those in 1811. But it did certainly have an impact on cent production and the production of other coins as well. If you know a little about the War of 1812 and you know a little bit about large cents, you probably think my talk title is completely insane because classic head cents are only dated 1808 to 1814, and the War of 1812 was long since over by 1816. So why am I even talking about this? Am I crazy? Well, I don't think I'm crazy, and I hope you'll agree with me by the time I'm done. So let's give a little context. 1815 was the end of the War of 1812. The negotiators had actually signed the treaty in December of 1814 to end the war, but neither government knew about it. We'll come to that in a few minutes. And a battle or two still took place after that, and we'll talk about that too. US gold and silver coins dated 1815 are quite rare, particularly the gold coins, as you will see. US copper coins dated 1815 are unknown. At least genuine unmutilated US copper coins dated 1815 are unknown. We'll show you a couple of examples of US copper coins dated 1815 later on. However, many cents are said to have been produced in 1815. And the question is, were they? And if there were, what were they? So 1815, the War of 1812 ended. In 1814, the British figured they had won. This is a picture, a contemporary painting of the US Capitol in September of 1814, because in August of 1814, the British sacked the city of Washington and burned the Capitol, and you can see that it's burned out to the exterior walls. There's basically nothing left of it. It had to be completely rebuilt. It wasn't just the Capitol they burned. This is the president's house. It was not then called the White House. It wasn't until much later it was called that, but you can see the president's house was also burned out entirely to the walls. People who see this picture often wonder what that squiggle is up on the roof. Nobody knows. Your first thought probably is it's some kind of electrical wire, but they didn't have electrical wiring in 1814, so it can't be that. It might be some kind of a remnant of a tree or a shrub or something that was growing on the roof. Nobody really knows. It's a mystery that probably will never be solved. Anyway, the British figured they had won the war because they just completely sacked the capital city of the United States. They figured that it was all over. But September 11th, 1814, the Battle of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain. A lot of the War of 1812 was fought on the Great Lakes and in what was then the west of the United States, meaning areas like Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and so on, that later became states. This was largely a land and naval battle, Battle of Plattsburgh. And the Americans completely defeated the British. You can see the large British ship of the line with its sail in tatters right in the middle of the image. And that was a 9/11 that was a pretty good day for the United States. We've had other 9/11s that weren't so good since then. Our ships were much smaller than theirs, but we had position and we did defeat them. And then September 12 to 14, Fort McHenry in Baltimore. the British decided that they were going to take the city of Baltimore, and they did that with a combination of naval and Army and Marines. They landed the land troops ashore, and they were going to march to Baltimore, and they left the ships in the harbor, and they couldn't get too much closer than you see here because the Americans had sunk a bunch of ships in the harbor to make it impossible for the British to get any closer. But you can certainly see in this picture, just below the center of the image, that little fort with the American flag flying and the bomb falling into it. You can see the bombs bursting in air. You can't see the rocket spread glare in this picture. But the British bombarded the fort for 25 straight hours and did very, very little damage to the fort. Nobody was killed. And they finally decided that this wasn't going to go anywhere, so they withdrew. Part of the reason that they withdrew is that their land troops, as they were marching towards the city of Baltimore, found a 3-mile-long trench that was manned by over 10,000 American troops and a large number of militiamen as well. The city was very heavily defended, unlike Washington, D.C., which wasn't defended at all. And so they turned around and they went home. Before that battle, before either of those battles actually, negotiations were already underway for a treaty in Ghent in Belgium. To the Americans, this was considered a second war for independence. Partly that was because of American politics. At that time, the federal government really did not like the British at all and liked the French much more. But to the British, this was another side conflict of the greater Napoleonic Wars in Europe. We really didn't side with Napoleon, but we really didn't like the British. And both sides were basically getting tired of fighting, particularly the British. And the Americans, which I see a typo, sorry about that, weren't giving up. It's always amazing how you never find a typo until the wrong time. So here's a painting of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. James Gambier, Admiral of the Fleet, the gentleman shaking hands with the other gentleman, John Quincy Adams, who at that time was American ambassador to Russia. And Adams, of course, was the son of John Adams, second president, and then he later became president himself. But those were the gentlemen who largely negotiated the treaty, and they signed it in late December of 1814. And of course, they signed it in Ghent, in Europe, and somebody had to send a ship to the United States to let the Congress know that they had a treaty to ratify, and the Senate ratified it in February of 1815. The Treaty of Ghent was remarked in medallic form, as you'd expect. This is a particularly pretty one, I think. Peace spreads her influence o'er the Atlantic shores, and we have the goddess of peace standing on a scallop shell like the birth of Venus, holding olive branch in her left hand and glory, rays of glory coming from her right hand, and she's breathing peace on the waters. And on the back, we have the dove of peace surrounded by a glory, conquered between Great Britain and America, crossed palms tied up with a beautiful bow ribbon surrounding that. A very, very pretty medal and a very, very important thing to celebrate. The two sides basically agreed to go back to where they were at the beginning of the war. The American side didn't really gain anything. The British side didn't really gain anything. The only people that lost were the Native Americans who had thrown their lot in with the British, and both sides basically threw them to the wolves. So this was an early case of the Native Americans getting badly screwed over by the Americans and the British as well in this case. They were the big losers. But there was one more major battle, and if you're of a certain age, you remember this record by Johnny Horton, the Battle of New Orleans. It says in 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. The battle was actually fought in 1815, but the battle was a decisive victory for the Americans, and Andrew Jackson became a national hero for beating the British in this battle, and he eventually became President of the United States, largely as a result of all this. So again, the war should have been over when this happened, but we didn't know it yet. Neither the Army knew it, nor did the Senate know it, for that matter. So let's talk about the mint during the war. This is supposed to be a coin talk after all, and we haven't talked about coins yet. During the war, cents were struck in normal quantities, and they were all struck on planchets that were received from Matthew Bolton between 1807 and 1811, totaling 60 tons. These were planchets that were sent by Matthew Bolton between 1807 and 1811. The last shipment actually arrived in early 1812, April 15th, 1812. War was declared about 8 weeks after that, and obviously we were not going to be able to get any more planchets from England until that war was over. Half dollars were struck in normal quantities. Half dollars were primarily used by banks for large transactions, much in the same way that later banks used silver dollars just for large transactions. They stored them in bags and they moved them from one bank to the other when they had to. And in fact, that's the reason that there are so many half dollars of that period that exist today in high grade, because they didn't circulate. They just used them for large bank transactions. Half eagles were also struck in normal quantities. They too were used largely by banks. They didn't really circulate. No other coin types were struck during the War of 1812. No half cents, no half dimes, no dimes, no quarters, no dollars, no quarter eagles, and no eagles were struck during the entire War of 1812. At the end of the war, the mint had no bullion to strike gold or silver coins. The reason was that during wartime, people tend to hoard precious metals, or at least times of stress and strife. People tend to hoard precious metals. And if we think back August of 1814, when the US Capitol was sacked and burned, that would be a good time for you to hoard your gold or silver if you were an American. So the mint had no bullion to strike any gold or silver coins. Would-be depositors hoarded it, as I said. There were no planchets to strike copper coins anymore. The last 357,830 cents were delivered on October 27th, 1814. Now think about that, 357,830 and October 27th. We'll come back to that in just a moment. The trade embargo with Britain prevented the importation of copper planchets during the war, of course. So this is an important little book for numismatists. It's an autographic book. It's in the Mint archives. It's called The Treasure of the Mint, Receipts for Copper Coins. And what it has in it is a list of the number of copper coins, cents and half cents, that were delivered to the treasurer of the mint by the chief coiner by date. So in other words, every time the chief coiner delivered any copper coins to the treasurer, It's listed in there. Now, people are used to what they call warrants for the delivery of coins. Warrants are a completely different thing. Those are documents that the mint director signs saying, I want the chief coiner to deliver X to the treasurer. And you'll find that in the early days, and 1812 was one of the early days, the warrants were not what you would find in this book. What you would find is smaller deliveries that were combined into the larger warrants. So here's a page in there. I don't expect you to read it, but I do expect you to see that this is just one page. The top entry is received 28th October, 1814 from Adam Eckfeldt, Chief Coiner of the Mint, $15.00, Mint of the United States, Treasurer's Office, Philadelphia, for James Rush, G. Ehrenzeller. $15.00 is 1,500 cents, not very many. That would be approximately an hour's work for a coinage press. And that's all that was delivered that day. Now think back to the previous slide, and I said there were 357,500 delivered the day before that. Actually, this $15 is part of that, And this was what was delivered to make the last of that delivery, or the last of that warrant. I hope that makes sense. The next entry just below it says received 3rd February 1816 from Adam Eckfeldt, Chief Coiner of the Mint, $1,835 Mint of the United States Treasurer's Office for James Rush, G. Ehrenzeller. So $1,835 is $183,500 cents, $183,500. And those were delivered the 3rd of February. And there are 2 more entries below that for February of 1816, one the 20th and one the 26th, which we won't really talk about. I want you to see, however, that on this page, the entry for the 28th of October, 1814 is followed immediately by the entry for the 3rd of February, 1816. There was nothing delivered between those 2 dates. Okay, makes sense? I hope. Anyway, in 1815, activity at the Mint ramped up. Up to 4 denominations were struck during the year. And I say up to because for reasons which you'll see in a moment. We know that half eagles were struck, exactly 635 of them. We'll return to that. Quarter dollars were struck, 69,232. Were half dollars struck? There are certainly half dollars dated 1815. They're scarce, but they certainly exist. And how about cents? There's a report that cents were struck. So let's go to the half eagles. 635 of them were struck on November 3rd. This is a pretty nice looking one. I would call this a very, very nice AU. Very attractive coin. 635 of them struck. That took perhaps a half hour to coin the entire mintage. Setting up the press, getting the dies in place. They may have spent an hour or 2 working on this entire mintage of 1815 half eagles. Very pretty coin. 1815 quarter dollar. Again, this is a nice coin. I believe this was an Eric Newman coin. Beautiful toning on it. 69,232 were delivered in 1815. And they were delivered after the half eagles. Another 20,003 were delivered on January 10th, 1816. And I want you to keep in mind that the chief coiner was not allowed to keep precious metals in any form beyond the end of a fiscal quarter, which means that the 20,003 that were delivered on January 10th were made from silver that the chief coiner received no earlier than January 1st. So these coins were struck sometime between January 1st and January 10th. And here's an 1815/2 half dollar. All of the 1815 half dollars are over a 2. There was only one die pair. Again, I think this is an Eric Newman coin. Some beautiful, beautiful coins in his collection. 47,150 were delivered on January 10th, 1816. Same day that those 20,003 quarters were delivered. And again, these have to have been struck no earlier than January 1. And the mint could easily have done that because the mint could strike about 15,000 coins per day at that time. And so 67,000 coins could easily have been struck in the first 10 days of January. That would not be overworking the mint personnel at all. So halves and quarters were struck during the first 10 days of January. Now, back to cents. Once the war was over, the mint ordered 5 tons of cent planchets from Matthew Bolton in England. They arrived sometime in the fall and were supposedly offloaded from the ship. They arrived in the bilge of ships. They were offloaded in the fall, and 465,500 cents were delivered during February of 1816. These planchets, by the way, came in kegs, and as I said, they were put in the bilge because they were very, very heavy, and they wanted to balance the ship when it was sailing. And because bilges tend to be wet and barrels tend to be leaky, a lot of times salt water would get in and it would lightly corrode the planchets. So the mint would sometimes have to clean those before they could strike them. And if the planchets were too damaged, they would just melt them down and use them as alloy for gold or silver. It's very unlikely, despite what you may have read, that dark and porous planchets were actually used for coinage. When we say a coin is on a porous planchet, that's something that dealers tell us to make us think that the coin was struck that way. But if a coin is porous, it's been corroded and somebody removed the corrosion, and that happened after striking, not before. So 465,500 delivered during February. What were they and when were they made? And that's what we're going to talk about next. Most people have traditionally believed that they carried the date 1816. They were, after all, struck during 1816. So that would be a perfectly logical thing. But the question is, could the mint have developed a new design and coined over 465,000 cents during the first 6 weeks of the year? The answer is probably not, but some in the past have gotten by this by saying they made the 1816 dated dies in 1815, contemplating the notion that new coin or that new blanks would be arriving. Again, there's no evidence for that, and the question is, did they? So we know half and quarter dollars dated 1815 were struck and delivered in 1816. None of the 1815 halves were struck before January of 1816, so the entire mintage of those was delivered the year after the date on the coin. Just like the mintage of dollars from 1804 was composed entirely of 1803 dated dollars. The original 1804 dollars were struck in 1834. And as I said, the chief coiner was not allowed to keep precious metals either coined or as bullion beyond the end of a quarter. So he didn't have any of these coins at the end of December. All of them were made in January. And it was common for the mint at that time to deliver many different types in dates after that on the coin. We know, for example, in half cents that one variety was not struck until, of 1803 dated half cent was not struck until 1805. And that's fairly common. No examples are known from the era in which a variety was struck before the year on the coin. So if cents were struck in December of 1815, they would probably not have been struck from dies that were dated 1816. So in other words, perhaps the cents delivered were dated 1814. Question, were cents struck in 1815? R.W. Julian wrote in The Numismatist a long time ago, what is clear beyond any doubt is that cent coinage was executed in 1815, although no original coins are known to carry this date. Well, he had a good source for making this claim. Mint Director Patterson on January 1st of 1816 wrote, a fresh supply of copper having lately been received at the mint, we have again resumed the coinage of cents. That's a pretty good source for saying that cent coinage happened in 1815. But what did Patterson really mean by this? Did he mean that they really started striking coins in December? Or did he mean that we've got planchets now, so our hiatus of striking copper coins that began in 1814 can be over and we can start making them and deliver them as soon as we want? Going back to that page from the Treasurer of the Mint's receipt book, Adam Eckfeldt delivered no cents to the treasurer between October 28, 1814 and February 3, 1816. He sometimes delivered even very small amounts to the treasurer. You can see that the top delivery there was 1,500 cents. That's not very many. He actually delivered even smaller amounts on other occasions. So if they had spent an hour using cents to, or using the blanks to strike coins in December, he would have delivered them to the treasurer, but he didn't. So going back to that, what was this coinage, if it did happen, and what happened to it? Number one, I want to say there is no record of it. There's no record that anybody has found with mint records that there were in fact cents coined in December of 1815. That doesn't mean they didn't, because the mint often did test strikings from each new batch of planchets. They wanted to make sure that the planchets were okay. And it's quite possible that that's what Patterson was referring to, a test striking from a new batch of planchets. And if they did that, what were the dies that they used and what happened to the coins that were struck? Most likely, I think, the coins that they struck were probably melted down and used as alloy for gold or silver, although they could conceivably have been mixed in with the large number that were minted in later in January and February. And as I said, perhaps none were struck at all. We just don't know. January 11th, 1816, this is quoted from the United States Gazette from Philadelphia. About 2 o'clock this morning, fire broke out in a part of the back buildings belonging to the mint. The cause totally unknown. The machinery employed in preparing gold and silver bullion for coinage has suffered considerable injury, but little or no loss either in bullion or coins of the precious metals will be sustained. The front part of the buildings containing the coinage presses, books, and the clerk's office with the engravers and assayers' apartments is uninjured. The building that burned was a horse mill. They used horsepower. I mean, by horsepower, I mean they used horses to power it, that were used to operate the rolling mills that reduced the thickness of the strip that was going to be used to coin gold and silver coins. And because that mill was destroyed, no more gold or silver coins could be made in 1816 until that mill was replaced. I want to read the last paragraph because it's kind of interesting, tells us some things about the time. The director and other officers of the establishment tender their warmest thanks to the fire companies and other vigilant citizens for their prompt and successful exertions in extinguishing this alarming fire. Focus in on the word fire companies. We are used to municipal fire departments. Your town, my town, all have fire departments, and these fire departments come and fight fires. At that time, there were not generally municipal fire departments. What there were was companies, fire companies, that were basically insurance companies. And if you paid this particular fire company to protect your property, if it caught fire, they would go and try to put the fire out. If you did not pay that particular fire company, even if they were next door, they'd let your house burn to the ground. It was a sort of a mob practice, perhaps, or an extortion deal. But that's how things worked in those days. But apparently the U.S. Mint didn't have a particular fire company that it worked with, and several companies and other neighbors came and fought the fire and prevented it from being much worse. Fire companies, by the way, your house was identified as to which fire company you subscribed by having a plaque on the front of the building. And if they didn't see that plaque, they didn't fight your fire. So the effects of the fire. First of all, no more silver or gold coins could be minted until the rolling mill was replaced, and that was done in 1817. And when they replaced the mill, they actually replaced it with a steam-powered mill that replaced the horses, probably a 2-horsepower steam engine to replace 2 horses. Copper coins could be struck because the rolling mills were not used to produce copper planchets. And as I said, almost 467,000 planchets were on hand from the December delivery. 183,500 were delivered on February 3rd, and 282,000 were delivered later in February. And if you do a little arithmetic, you find that that left about 1,500 planchets that perhaps produced spoiled coins that were then melted down, or that were just melted down for some other reason. So the December planchets were coined and delivered in February and January. Another little side thing that's kind of funny, in 1832, and this is, I've seen this in newspapers from the period, people were paying as much as 75 cents for a single 1814 cent, despite the fact that collectors were paying less than 20 cents in general for those. And in fact, they were still current, so you could spend an 1814 cent for 1 cent in 1832. It was reported that gold had been mixed in with the copper in 1814, causing speculation. So people were buying these things up with the hope of melting them down to get a little gold out of them, which of course is ridiculous because the mint didn't make the planchets. They didn't make any of them. They were all purchased from Bolton in England, and many of them were from the same shipment used throughout the War of 1812. So this tulip mania for people paying too much for an 1814 cent back in the 1830s made no sense whatsoever. Pun intended. So what do the coins tell us? What do the coins tell us about what these were? One thing that we have learned is that 1814 cents are far more common relative to the other classic head cents if the total mintage was 357,830, the mintage from 1814. We also know that 1816 cents are much less common than other coins of the period if all of the coins the February mintage was dated 1816. Pardon me. 1814 cents are about equally common relative to the other classic heads if the total mintage was 823,330, the mintage from 1814 through February of 1816. Excuse me. This was shown by Ron Manley in a study of eBay appearances back in 2001, and it was for the most part ignored by large cent collectors because it went against the received wisdom from previous people who said that all of the cents coined in 1816 were dated 1816. It was, however, confirmed by me in a study of PCGS and NGC graded coins in early 2015. I was doing this project on the bicentennial of the 1815 end of the War of 1812. So I don't want to go through this too much, but if we look at the data, in 1808 to 9, the total mintage was just under 608,000. 1810 to 11, the mintage was just under 1.7 million. 1812 to 13, 1.4 million, 1.5 million. And 1814, 358,000 roughly. The percentages of the total, 1808 to 9 is 14.7, 10 to 11 is 40, 12 to 13 is 36, and 1814 is about 9%. Pardon me. Ron Manley's eBay database, my PCGS and NGC databases, all pretty close to the mintage percentage for 1808 to 9. Low for 1810 to 11. Pretty close to 1812 to 13. And very, very high for 1814. More than double what you'd expect on eBay and triple what you'd expect in PCGS and NGC. However, if the mintage for the last ones are 1814 through February of 1816, we find that those numbers are actually much closer. eBay percentage is a little tiny bit high. The PCGS and NGC numbers are still a little higher. And the reason that they are high is that there's a large number of these that have been slabbed in high grade. A lot of the 1814s were saved because they were the last of their kind, presumably. And so there are more of them in high grade than for the earlier dates. So when could the cents have been made? We know the mint was striking silver until January 10th. So we don't think they were making any of these cents until after that. We know the fire was on the 11th. January 15th, which was a Monday, to February 3rd, which is a Saturday, the first day they delivered cents, is exactly 18 work days. It was a 6-day work week, 11 hours a day. We know the mint could strike about 15,000 coins per work day. And so if cents were struck every day, they would only have had to average about 10,000 per day to make that February 3rd delivery. So the mint could easily have produced all of those cents during that period. So back to our question, would or could the mint have developed a new design and struck the coins in 3 weeks? Again, highly unlikely. The cents must have been coined from a leftover die. And we even know which obverse die was used. There are two varieties of 1814 cent, the plain 4 on the top and the crosslet 4, which you can see has this little crossbar on the 4. The S295 and S294 are Sheldon numbers that are of interest to large cent collectors. You don't need to know those. But the S295, the plain 4 variety, is somewhat more common than the S294. So the one that was struck in 1816 is this one, the plain 4, an unused plain 4 die left over from 1814, was not used until 1816 and coined large cents in 1816. Now, if you absolutely positively have to have an 1815 dated large cent to fill that really hard to fill hole in your collection, you can get those. The one on the right is obviously an altered 1845. It's not very cleverly done, and it's completely the wrong type. It's a type that was not produced until the 1840s, so it shouldn't fool anybody at all. The one on the left, however, was a pretty nice, a fairly high-grade 1813 large cent that somebody mutilated to turn the 3 into a 5. Somebody took a coin that was pretty nice and had some real value to it and mutilated it to make something that today now would be worth much less than it was. And if you really want an 1815 dated cent, you can buy them now. There are companies that have made them in recent years. There's no copy stamp on this because there were no 1815 cents, so it's not a copy of an 1815 cent. And the style, the design is completely wrong for the era. So this would not fool anybody, or at least it should not fool anybody. Besides, it's much too nice to be an 1815 cent. So when were the 1816 dated cents delivered? The next delivery of cents after February 27th was September 30th of 1816, 7 months later. So there was plenty of time to develop the new design and strike the coins. And here's an 1816 cent. It was designed either by John Reich or Robert Scott. Scott was the chief engraver. Reich was his assistant. There's controversy about who designed this particular coin. Breen said it was by Scott because it was spectacularly ugly. But Reich was actually going blind at the time, so maybe he was the designer. We really don't know. And I thank you for your attention. If you want to read more, there are some references. The middle one can be downloaded from the Newman Numismatic Portal. The first article that I did on the subject was in Coin World in February of 2015, and then another one, the Numismatist of 2018. And I thank you for your attention.
All right, thanks a lot, Bill. We do have a few questions here. A couple of people suggested the squiggle over the White House was a lightning rod.
Oh, could be.
So, next question, is the book Receipts for Copper Coins available on NNP?
It is not. It was not scanned with the other things that were scanned. So it is not available that way. It's one of the few mint documents of the era that I know of that is not available there.
Right.
However, I have a Xerox copy of most of it, at least. I received it from Craig Sholey.
Okay. All right. We'll work on that afterwards.
Okay.
All right. Next one. What was the penalty if the bullion was held over into another fiscal quarter?
It didn't really say in the records what the penalty was. It just said that they were not allowed to do it. I don't know what the penalty would have been. It was just something that was not done. I don't know the answer.
Okay. So was that maybe more a matter of practice than legislation?
No, it was an official mint rule.
Okay. All right. Next thing, is there anything on the assay reports, assay commission reports with respect to this date?
I don't think that they assayed copper coins, did they? I thought they only assayed gold and silver.
Yeah, and
they wouldn't really care if the copper coin was pure, because it wasn't. Copper coins weren't legal tender at the time anyway, so I don't think they would have cared.
Yeah. Roger Burdett has published the assay commission reports for 1800 on up. So that'd be one place to look. But yeah, I think what you say makes sense. The assay commission might not have been concerned about those. All right, last question. So when were the 1816 coronet cents minted?
Again, like I said, they would have started minting them sometime probably during the summer. They could have started minting them as early as April. They would have to have started minting them at least by July to get as many made by the end of the year as they were made. We don't know exactly when they started making them because they didn't keep track of exactly when coins were struck at that time.
Okay, another question, slightly off topic, but why do so many classic head cents come corroded and ugly compared to other series either before or after them?
I think the main reason for that is that they're actually quite a bit scarcer than the ones before or after. And so the number of nice ones that are left is just small relative to the ones before and after them. I don't think it's because there are a higher percentage of the coins that are corroded and ugly. I think it's just that we have access to more coins that are not corroded and ugly among the drake busts and the matron heads. It's not so much what there is as what we see.
All right, next question. I'm new to this topic. Notice the title says 1816 classic head cents, but I thought collectors call those coronet head cents. What's the difference between classic and coronet head?
Okay. Well, can we go back to the slides?
Yeah, if you want to continue sharing, we can do that.
Let me do that again here. I'm going to have to go back. All right, can you see that? Or because I have the Q&A in front of me.
Yeah, we can see.
You can see the Q&A or you can see the coin?
We see the coin.
Okay, okay, good. So this is the 1814 that was actually made in 1816. And so I'm calling this the 1816 classic head cent. Okay, it isn't dated 1816, but it was made in 1816. And that's why the title to the talk. And then that is what you would expect for an 1816 cent. And as I said, those were struck later in the year and delivered later in the year. I hope that answers.
All right, and next question. Did I understand you to say that the mint began using a steam press in 1817? I think you were referring to the roller press, right?
Right, that was just the roller mill. That the steam coinage presses came in 1836. Okay, coins were not minted by steam power until 1836.
But the steam power was used for the mill, which was a definite upgrade from the mint because they went from horsepower to mill power.
That's exactly right. Yes.
So, the smell in the mint yard was probably slightly better after that.
Yeah, they said in the early 1900s that the automobile was the solution to urban pollution.
Oh my. Well,
you didn't have to shovel up after a car.
Yeah, it probably helped, but created other issues. Next question. Can you review again why you think the plane 4 was struck in 1816 versus the crosslet 4?
Yeah, the basic reason is that the plane 4 is more common than the crosslet 4, and there were more that were made in 1816 than were made in 1814. There were some 600,000, I don't remember the exact numbers, I don't have it in front of me, but there were some 600 and some thousand in 1816 and some, I'm sorry, there were 300,000 in 1814 and 400 and some thousand in 1816. So in other words, the more common one is the one that was made in 1816. We have no proof that that's the case, but it wouldn't make sense for it to be otherwise.
All right, and another question, how did you get started collecting early large sets?
That's a completely different story that would have been sort of appropriate for Kellen Hord's talk a little earlier this afternoon. But when I was a kid in Boy Scouts, I was working on a coin collecting merit badge. And I used to go to a coin shop in my hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I was putting together a typeset for the merit badge. And I was particularly attracted to the weird coins, the 2-cent pieces, the 3-cent pieces, the half dimes, the half cents, the really large cents. And I just always found those coins fascinating because they didn't exist anymore in my lifetime. And one of the coins that I bought was a dateless Liberty Cap cent. I think I paid $2 for it or something. It was with me for many years, and when I was in my middle 40s, I had a little disposable income and decided that I was going to start collecting coins again. And I checked a copy of Sheldon's book out of the A&A library, and it took me about 10 or 15 minutes with Sheldon's book to identify the die variety of my dateless Liberty Cap cent as a Sheldon 29, a 1794 Sheldon 29. And I just thought it was so incredibly cool that you could do this with a coin that was very low grade and didn't even have a date on it, but you could tell exactly what it was, that I started joining Early American Coppers very shortly after that. And the rest is history.
I noted this story in another session, but Harry Foreman told me that, you know, Walter Breen could look at the back of a large cent and immediately attribute it. I think that may be partially apocryphal, but to some extent it's probably true.
Definitely apocryphal. You wouldn't be able to attribute the 1814s from the back because they used the same one.
Mm-hmm. All right, another question. Can you please go over the reason for the design change from classic to coronet head?
I don't think anybody really knows. There don't seem to be records that order a design change, certainly not most of the time. I think just maybe a change in fashion. The various designs, you know, the earliest designs lasted a very short period of time. The chain cents were only struck for 2 weeks. The wreath cents were struck for about 2 weeks and then again for a few days, a couple of months later. 1793 Liberty Caps were struck for 2 days. 1794 Liberty Caps were struck for 1 year, and so on. They changed designs very, very frequently in those days. The Drake bust lasted about a decade. That was remarkable.
Yeah, you know, I think part of it was that, first of all, American coins weren't circulating that much. I mean, the coin of the realm was the Spanish dollar. So the production is low. So design changes aren't that big a deal. Now, when we get into the 20th century and Theodore Roosevelt wants to redesign the 20th century coinage, that's a big deal. And there's a lot of surviving documentation.
Yeah.
But even, you know, going into the 1830s for the Liberty seated coinage, there's a lot of documentation surrounding how the design evolved, but I don't think anything that actually talks about the original rationale for deciding that we're going to change the design of all the silver coins.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, a very good point. The most famous example, I think, of all this is all of the books say that the chain cent was ended because the public hated it, and they quote a newspaper article of criticizing the design and saying, Alexander the coppersmith has done me great harm, referring to Alexander Hamilton, who of course had nothing whatsoever to do with the mint.
Sure.
But they thought he did because he was the Secretary of the Treasury. The mint was actually under Thomas Jefferson at the time.
Right.
And when the chain cent mintage was 36,000, and there were about 50,000 people living in greater Philadelphia. So it's unlikely that most of the people in the Philadelphia area had ever even seen one when it was discontinued. And certainly other parts of the country, people had not seen them. So, you know, these things that we read about criticism of coinage designs in the early days, they're in the Red Book, I know. You know, they're the kind of things that we've read since we were kids, but you know, we have to take them with a grain of salt because they just really don't hold up to the cold light of truth.
Yeah, and you know, the other point is the coinage was just not that big a deal to the government at that time. They just had bigger fish to fry.
Absolutely.
So, and if chain cents were only struck for 2 weeks, the idea that somebody would complain and a bureaucratic change would happen that quickly just seems unlikely.
Right, exactly.
All right, well, we're about at our time limit. So Bill, thank you very much for presenting.
My pleasure.
We have a couple of presentations left at the 5 o'clock hour. They're both about gold coins. So feel free to check those out. And again, thanks for attending, and thanks again, Bill, for presenting.
My pleasure. Thank you.